So if we start out, we look at Genesis 1:1a. This is a long scripture. We're going to read about 4 words. In Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's it for that verse. That's a statement. In the beginning, God created. Then if we look at Colossians 1:16, verse 16. I use sticky tabs so I can find it quicker. Colossians 1, verse 16. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. Those are very, very definite. Those are not, there's no room for wiggle room there. It says God created. God created the earth. Well, many people think that science has proven that wrong. That science has proven God didn't create the earth. It all just happened, or however, that it wasn't God. Well, is that true? Are they right? Well, a lot of what this book talks about is how everything that's going on in the world now, everything that you hear, all the things that we wonder, how can the world have gone so downhill in the last 40, 50 years? A lot of that is warped by a philosophy called naturalism, where people are taking their belief system and they're trying to make science prove what they believe. It's another form of a religion. It's just a different religion. It's a religion that disagrees with ours. Making science show what you really believe. It's the belief that natural causes alone are sufficient to explain everything that exists. Everything just happened by natural causes. There was no need for a creator. So what's happened, you can look at, and the book does, very thorough discussions through biology, through physics, through all the different sciences, and what has happened, what's been done, and what it shows and what it doesn't show. For centuries, scientists maintained that the physical universe was eternal, that there was no need for a creator because it existed forever. It always existed. Nobody created it. Well then, in the 60s, as they started digging up more and more evidence, and they started, Gordon would be very good at this, they started discovering that things were disappearing. I think that stars were dying, various things were happening. Well, if everything existed forever, how could things be disappearing all the time? And why would there be anything left? So then they came up with the idea that this universe, this world, happened at a very specific time, that this came into existence. Well, what would that make you think? God created it. Well, they didn't want to think that God created it. So what did they come up with? The Big Bang Theory, which is an interesting TV show that's really going downhill. I don't know if you watch it. I thought it was pretty silly most of the time, so it's fun because it's so silly. But more and more, it is becoming somewhat of a Sheldon's mom is a Christian and she's just an idiot, you know, that she believes that stuff. So I guess it's probably the end of that show for me. It is cute actors and cute everything, but that's a serious. They decided to come up with the Big Bang Theory. They ignored all known science, and again, he gets much more specific in it than I do into that. Decided that the universe came out of nothing. But science clearly teaches that something can't come out of nothing. So they've got a real dilemma here, because they've got the idea that it had to come out of nothing, but the idea that it can't come out of nothing. So what does it say? That told them that there had to be an outside force for this to come into existence. There had to be something outside that could make this happen. What would be the logical answer? God. Okay, but they don't want that. Okay, so all of this evidence of how the world began fits very well with the idea that God created in the heavens and the earth, just like the scripture says. And the Big Bang Theory is full of conflicting information that doesn't work. So how about life? How did life come to be? Genesis 1:20 through 27. it's time for a new Bible. But that's a good sign, right? And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living thing and every moving thing with which the waters teem, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas. Let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning the fifth day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kind, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kind, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. So different kinds, he made all the different kinds of animals, and he did it. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So again, many people think that science has disproved the idea that God created life. So, how do people that don't want to believe in God account for the fact of life? The answer came in Darwin's theory of evolution, which is very much taught now. And I'm not going to get into any politics or anything, I'm just going to get into science. The theory has been latched on to all the branches of science. Biology, psychology, science, everything is latched onto this as being the alternative for God. It's Darwin's theory. They use it as basis for their theories, for their experiments, and their total thought process. And it is a religion. It's a religion that supersedes everything they do. Anyone who doesn't adhere to that belief system is either ignorant or uneducated. So, there are numerous problems with that, and they're all based on science. And this might be a good point to tell a little story. As an engineer, we run tests all the time. That's constantly what we do. I work with adhesives and solders very heavily, so I'll say this is a very good adhesive to use for this purpose. We have to run that through 2 years of tests. Every test you can possibly imagine, we run that through. Now, if I am a big proponent of that adhesive, and I run those tests, I can very easily slant those tests to get what I want to get out of that. Just in how I test them and how I mix them, how I cure them, how I do whatever I want to do. And in fact, one of my first projects at Lake Region Medical was to develop a new solder paste for soldering to nitinol. Nitinol is very difficult to solder to. And I had a very short period of time. So I just through research, found a solder and ordered that solder, tried it. It worked very well. I had such a short time to develop it that I got a fellow engineer to help me to publish the results on it. He didn't like it because he had a different kind of solder that he liked better, that he wanted them to use. Well, what did he publish? He published a paper showing what a piece of junk it was. How it didn't work, how you could reflow it over and over again and it wouldn't melt, how it was just a piece of garbage. And it was totally false. None of it was correct. He had pictures to support it. He had the whole 9 yards to support how this didn't work. And I've been working for 3 years now to get that implemented. And they're starting to implement it. Everybody that's used it, it works great. They love it. But he came to absolutely totally contradictory opinion because what he wanted to get for a result. And that can happen in science too. The experiment may be perfectly correct. It may give a conclusion, but they may not use the same conclusion. They may not draw the same conclusion that somebody else would who didn't have the bias in the first place. So, what happens with evolution? We'll get back on track. So, Darwin's theory was that very small changes over a very long time is what causes things to happen. Millions of years, very tiny changes over millions of years is what his theory is based on. So as geeks on computers got going, mathematicians, and started playing with things and trying to see what they could do with their computers, one of the things they did is develop a formula and tried to figure out what the chance is that life developed by little changes over a long period of time, purely by chance. What are the odds? None. It can't happen by mathematical formulas on a computer. So mathematicians were in competition with people who are very strong proponents of evolution. And so what had to happen? It couldn't have happened over very small changes over a long period of time. Something had to cause it to happen. So, find my place here. So what happens with that? They have to figure out how that could have happened in a lab, how life could have happened in a lab, and how it could have happened with just the right conditions. If we have time, I'll read you a quick portion here because it gets kind of hard to summarize this real quickly. It'll give you a flavor for what the book is like. So a scientist named Miller worked on creating amino acids in a laboratory in experiments, and amino acids being a building block of life. If he could prove that you could create amino acids, he could prove that life could have happened by chance and something could have come out of this. But let's start with the amino acid that came out of Miller's test tube. And he did create an amino acid. The truth is that these differ in critical ways from those found in living things. Amino acids come in two forms, what scientists call left-handed and right-handed. Living things are highly selective. They use only the left-handed form. But when Miller and his colleagues mixed chemicals in the laboratory, they got both kinds, and even 50-50 mix, left and right-handed. In fact, this is what happens every time anyone mixes chemicals randomly in the laboratory. There's no natural process that produces only left-handed amino acids. The kind required by living things. All of this means that the amino acids formed in a test tube are totally useless for life. And that's only the first problem. The next step in creating life is to get amino acids to link up and form proteins. So a chemist worked on that, how he could boil the amino acids, induce them to react with one another. The result was protein-like chains of amino acids. Fox was promptly introduced into the modern hall of scientific heroes. But there's serious problems hidden beneath the hype. Because once again, life is much more selective than anything we get from a test tube. The proteins in living things are comprised of amino acids hooked together in very particular chemical bonds called peptide bonds. But amino acids are like tinker toy pieces. They're capable of hooking together in all sorts of different ways, forming different chemical bonds. In a test tube, that's exactly what they do. They hook up in a variety of ways, never producing a genuine protein capable of functioning in a living cell. In addition, for all protein to be functional, amino acids must be linked up in a particular sequence, just like the sequence of letters in a sentence. If you scramble the letters in a sentence, you get nonsense. If you scramble the amino acids in a protein, you get a non-functional protein. Yet in laboratory experiments, what we get are scrambled random sequences. There's no natural force capable of selecting the right amino acids, lining them up in the right order, and as a result, the protein-like chains that appear in the test tube are useless for life. The fact is, the much-touted experiments tell us very little about where real functional proteins come from. Yet this inconvenient fact is rarely mentioned when headlines blare out the news that scientists have succeeded in creating the building blocks of life. So, and even in that case, the interesting thing is in order to produce those amino acids that aren't capable of producing life, what did they use? Very, very pure chemicals. How do chemicals exist in the atmosphere? They don't stay pure, they want to combine with things. So very, very pure forms of chemicals They did it in beakers in very tightly controlled environments. They did some of it with very tightly controlled wavelengths of light to produce the heat, because sunshine wouldn't do it because of all the wavelengths. They had to pull the amino acids out the minute they were created or they were destroyed. It was very brilliant scientists who did this. What does that make you think of? Intelligent creator. Somebody who had to create this stuff. How could it happen in open nature, in the environment, when none of these conditions exist or could exist? It all points back again to an intelligent designer. And what about DNA? I had something I could have read about that too, but the amount of information in a single DNA is comparable to 4 times all the issues of Encyclopedia Britannica. If you take all 30 volumes or whatever, times 4, there's more information in DNA than in that. And that again is very, very selectively, very patterned. They're just even beginning to understand it. To think that that fell into place just by accident takes a whole lot more faith than to believe that God created the earth. So in Romans 1:20 says, and Gerald read this, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen." I would argue that scientists are clearly seeing. It's clearly seen. It's at a different level than we work at every day. But I think they're clearly seen by the tests that they do, by the experiments that they run. It's clearly seen. His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. By what God has made, they can study it. They can try to duplicate it. They can experiment. They can do whatever they want. And from that, they should clearly see that there had to be an intelligent design, an intelligent creator. And more scientists are coming to that conclusion. That's not a far-out idea. They aren't ready to accept that there's a God, but they are ready to accept that there had to be intelligence behind all of this, that it didn't just happen by chance. So, just to look at some of the stuff around us, the average things around us. Evolutionists ignore the evidence. So when you think of breeding, one of the big things that Darwin did, that he thought was leading to a proof of evolution, is breeding pigeons. And he bred pigeons, and he bred different kinds of pigeons. And he bred very, very fancy pigeons, very, very nice pigeons. And he said, look at this. Look at how I've changed pigeons. They're pigeons. They're still pigeons. If you take that fancy pigeon and you let it loose, what does it become? A plain pigeon. If you're breeding horses and you're breeding race horses, and you've got a wonderful stallion and a wonderful mare, and you're going to breed them, and you're going to make the best racehorse ever, and you put them out in the pasture with a whole bunch of mares and a whole bunch of stallions, do they care if they find each other? No. It all goes to pot. You'll end up with plain ordinary horses. That's what happens in nature. Things don't selectively become better. They breed things all the time. What else happens when you breed things? What happens when you breed a horse and a donkey? What do you get? A mule. How many mules reproduce mules? 0. They're sterile. That's the other thing that happens when you try to crossbreed things. They don't become stronger, they become weaker. A lot of times the purer the breed, the purer you get it, the weaker it gets. It doesn't get stronger, it doesn't get better, it gets weaker. So, that doesn't seem to point toward evolution. The bat is one of their big ones. There's one about a moth, which I probably shouldn't even bring up, a moth where the trees were turning darker because of pollution, and so they proved that moths were turning darker because they were adapting to the pollution so that they could hide better in the trees. The person who did it admitted that he painted moths and stuck them in the trees for the story. It's a well-documented story. So bats is one of their proofs. That bats, they believe that bats started out as a rodent that ran across the ground. That gradually it started forming wings, and the wings got bigger and bigger over, this is over thousands or millions or whatever years, and then eventually it could fly. Well, what happens to this rodent is it starts growing wings. Can't run very well, so it gets killed. I mean, you think about the transition from going from a rodent to a bat, all the stages in between are pretty worthless. Why would it change to that? How would it exist? The fish is a great one. It's always interesting to see the little cartoons of Darwin where the fish comes out of the water and has legs and walks off on land. Okay, you either have gills or you have lungs. And you don't have one, if you got gills, you live in the water. If you got lungs, you live on the land. If you got lungs and you're in the water, you drown. If you got gills and you're on the land, you die. So how did that transformation happen over millions of years, and why? Why did that fish decide it needed legs, and grew legs, and crawled out of the water? It just, it seems a little bit on the absurd side. We have enough time, I can read you one more quick. And these get very deep, so I'll mispronounce some of these words. But it's very interesting. One of the issues they have trouble with is the eye. When you think about the eye, why did the eye develop? Why did this glob all of a sudden decide it needed to see, and it had millions of years to develop what it needed to develop so that it could see when it didn't even know what was out there or anything? Darwin would have shuddered even harder had he known the structure of the cells inside the eye. Contemporary Darwinists, such as Richard Dawkins, have tried to solve the problem by tracing the pathway to the evolution of the eye, starting with a light-sensitive spot, moving to a group of cells, cupped so that they could focus the light better, and so on through a gradual series of small improvements to produce a lens. But even the first step, the light-sensitive spot, is irreducibly complex. How could this have evolved? Requiring a chain reaction of chemical reactions, starting with a proton interacting with a molecule called an 11-cis-retinol, which changes to trans-retinol, which forces a change to the shape of the protein called rhophism, which sticks to another protein called transducin, which binds to another molecule, and so on. And where do those cupped cells that Dawkins talks about come from? There are dozens of complex proteins involved in maintaining cell shape, and dozens more that control groups of cells. Each of Dawkins' steps is itself a complex system, and adding them together doesn't answer where these complex systems came from in the first place. It's as if we asked how a stereo system is made, and someone answered, you plug the speakers into the amplifier, and you put a CD in. The real question is, how did you make the speakers? How did you make the amplifier? How did you make the CD? It's not how they happen to come together. So, another interesting one that's often referred to, and I'll add just because it's cute, but if you go to a beach and you see "I love you" written in the sand, do you think that happened by the waves and by the wind? Yeah? If you'd find a watch laying on the beach, do you think that, there's silicon there that makes glass, maybe iron there, that could maybe make the band, the little chips, your cell phone, when you look at your cell phone, I'm fascinated by the electronics of these because I'm trained in that. These things probably have hundreds of resistors, the size of a pepper flake. They have transistors in here that are not much bigger. Capacitors, the size of a flake of pepper. They can't figure out equipment that can place those, hardly. They barely figured out how to get equipment to place those on a circuit board. Okay, if you see that, You think that happened by chance? Over millions of years? No. There was an engineer, a group, many, very intelligent engineers who worked hours and hours, years and years, decades, developing what goes into that cell phone. I don't think anybody looks at it and thinks it happened by chance. There's another interesting story I'll just touch on. But the one thing is that through naturalism they try to think we're just a higher form of animal. And when we read the creation story, it talks about men were created later. The animals were created, then man was created, man had dominion over the animals. But many naturalists don't believe that. So what they did in a zoo in Copenhagen, they made an exhibit with apes, and next to the exhibit of apes, they put a human couple. And the idea of the exhibit was to show how much humans are like the apes. And that people would come to see how that makes perfect sense, that we came from the apes. Well, what did the apes do? They picked fleas off each other and ate them. They went to the bathroom wherever they felt like. They walked around and did what apes do. What did the humans do? They had their computers there playing on the internet. One of them was fixing a motorcycle because he was bored with doing other things. When they needed to go to the bathroom, they got out, left, went to the bathroom, came back in. And they closed it after a very short period of time because what did they prove? They proved there's no similarity. I mean, they have some physical appearances that look the same, but the similarity was just not there. The humans were just doing absolutely totally different things that didn't relate at all to what the apes were doing. So again, down the tube. In fact, Darwin himself said, this is quoting him, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And it's just abundantly apparent that it wasn't a series of small changes, that it was a creation. The fossil evidence. Where are all these intermediate steps? You know, they find things that look weird, that look half bird, half dinosaur or something. Well, that's the way God created them. You'd have to find, Darwin himself is saying, you'd have to find infinitesimal little steps. You should, in the fossil record, find just change a little here, change a little here, change a little here, a little here, a little here. It's not there. So, why is Darwinism such a strong force? Why is it still taught? They would say, not because of its scientific validity, because it fits the worldview that excludes a creator God. One of Darwin's biggest supporters was Thomas Huxley. He was called Darwin's bulldog because he pushed the theory so hard. You know what he said about Darwin's theory? Doesn't amount to much of anything scientifically. That's what he said. He was one of the biggest proponents for it. So, naturalism is a worldview that will try to do anything to disprove the existence of an almighty God. Why? Why don't people want to acknowledge God? Acknowledge a creator? Gerald got into quite a bit of it with his talk on prayer. Where the world is going right now. What's happening with everything? Why is everything turning so much away from God? It's through all this, through naturalism. Why? Why don't they want to believe in a God? They don't want moral rules. They don't want somebody to say that it's wrong to do this, it's wrong to do that. It's wrong to do this. They don't want any of this guilt. There shouldn't be any guilt or anything. I should be able to do whatever I want to do. And nobody should be telling me what's right and wrong. Well, with God, there's right and wrong. And they don't want that, so they have to find another way. They don't want to believe that people are by nature evil. Over and over, and there's story after story after story in there where people try to create utopian societies. Many of the socialist societies, communist societies, again, not political, they might be something else. Just those kind of societies develop because people believe that everyone is inherently good. We're all good. It's religion, that makes us do bad things and makes us think there's bad and represses us, or it's other things that repress us. If it weren't for those things, everybody is inherently good. And if you just get rid of religion, if you get rid of morals, if you get rid of all these things, everything will be wonderful. Well, you get things like Nazism, like there's a group out in California they talk about that was into that. Any of these groups, what happens is somebody ends up being in control, because it doesn't just work on its own. Somebody ends up in control. That person becomes more and more paranoid. That person becomes more and more controlling. That person does more and more evil, and that's the direction it goes. They don't want to believe there's a supreme being who will someday judge them for what they have done. Right? They don't want to think that someday they're going to have to answer for what they've done, or what they've thought, or that there would be anybody that could have control over them, that could judge them. And they don't want to believe in such a thing as right and wrong. So is it true that all science is fact, and religion is just for those who need a crutch? No. And a lot of the stories in there, things came out of a man who took his daughter to Disneyland at Epcot Center in Florida. And they showed how the world was created out of nothing, and how life was created out of this and that and everything else. And he came out with his daughter, who was a Christian, and he said, okay, what did you think of all that? And she said, well, science is fact. That's what happened. Science is fact. What you believe is religion. And so he did a ton of research, and a lot of this is things that came through that research that he did and others did about is science fact. Yes, science can be fact. Science can be very good. I'm not attacking science. You could say I'm a scientist. There are many, many things we know. There are many, many things that are proved by science. But you have to go into it with an open mind. You can't go into it with an agenda that you're going to prove something that's actually religion.